Imagine you woke up tomorrow in your bed, you stretch, you open your eyes to find out that computers don't exist. And not just computers, but your smartphone, your tablet, the internet, and all the rest of it. Well, clearly, you'd go about your day a bit differently. You probably would be driving a really old-style car. You clearly would be quite a bit less anxious. You wouldn't know how the weather is going to turn out in the second half of the day. Your vitamins, your medicines, forget it. And emails, well, probably wouldn't exist, which, let's face it, is not such a terrible scenario. Well, every single aspect of your daily life would be completely different. Why am I saying all this? Well, because in the next 10 minutes, I want to talk to you about a new technological revolution that is unfolding in front of our eyes. A new technology that promises to help us solve some of humanity's hardest challenges, from designing new medicines, to understanding climate change and weather modeling, to coming up with better ways of storing energy. I'm talking about quantum computing. And as you listen to me, I want to hold in your head the image of how the world would look like without computers. Quantum computing might bring about a similar change to our daily lives. But let me start from the beginning, or rather, my beginning. I grew up just across the border in the north of Italy, and as a kid, I spent a lot of time running around in my parents' garden. And I was always endlessly curious about how things worked, how nature worked around me. I have this clear memory of me being maybe a 6 or 7-year-old and jumping up and down on my parents' bed, obviously without their consent, and thinking about, well, we're kind of stuck in the middle. We have this huge, enormous universe, these massive stars and galaxies above us, and inside of us, we have colonies of extremely small, tiny microorganisms, viruses, bacteria. Well, yeah, we are stuck in the middle. This was the first time that I thought about the concept of scale. And later on, I remember being very fixated with trying to understand how things inside things worked. So what's inside of what? For example, what's inside of our body? What's inside the organs inside our body? And what's inside the tissues inside the organs? And the cells inside the tissues? And the molecules inside the cells? And so it goes. I figured out that there was a science that was trying to ask these kind of questions and trying to find some answers, and it was physics. And so later, during high school, when my physics professor proposed a book club, I jumped on it. And she got us to read a book called Entanglement by Amir D. Axel. Entanglement. What a strange word. This was an extremely weird word I never heard before. And to be honest with you, I read this book, and I probably understood less than 5%. But the thing that really stayed with me was the fact that quantum physics was really trying to understand the fabric of reality at the most fundamental level, and that actually this was not all that intuitive. So I packed up my bags, and I went to the UK to study physics. And I kept stumbling upon this quantum physics, and it was by far the hardest subjects that I've ever studied. And maybe that's why I decided to go ahead and, well, research it. I ended up in Switzerland, in Zurich, to do my PhD in quantum computing. So what is this revolutionary quantum computing? Well, I told you about these atoms, molecules, atoms, that make up everything. They make up our bodies. They make up all the chairs that you're sitting on. They make up the air that we're breathing, this microphone. Well, it turns out that in the last few decades, 50 years or so, we became so good that we can now isolate a single atom and make it behave exactly as we want. In certain cases, we can use this atom to help us perform very complex calculations. And in other cases, well, we can use them to recreate Mario Kart video games and other classic video games. In my laboratory, for example, we were trying to isolate calcium atoms, calcium, the same one that makes up all of our bones, and to use electrical fields to isolate and move around these atoms in space, and laser beams to encode information inside the states of these particles. Well, indeed, quantum physics is very different from how our daily life goes. And in fact, it's not all this simple. So a quantum physics laboratory looks rather messy. What you'll see is lots of electrical cables, lots of machines with blinking colors that monitor signals, optical elements such as laser beams and lenses and mirrors, and at the very center, a large metal barrel. This large metal barrel is a vacuum chamber and a fridge that goes to the coldest temperatures in the universe. And at the very core stand the fragile quantum particles. It turns out that in order to isolate and manipulate single atoms and photons and electrons, one really requires the most exquisite engineering. And this is because quantum particles are extremely fragile, so that the quantum properties are preserved. They need to be extremely isolated from their surrounding. In fact, quantum particles behave completely different from what we're used to. They can establish connections even if they're extremely far apart. They can push and pass through barriers, and they can exist in multiple states at once. Well, in fact, quantum physics is a bit like magic. And that's just like magnetism was for us back in the Middle Ages, completely shocking and extremely confusing. And so if we try to think about something we are a bit more familiar with, how our computers work, well, they work using bits that can be either 0 or 1 in value. Well, quantum computing instead uses something called the qubits, the quantum bits. These are the atoms, the photons, the electrons. And what's so special about qubits is that instead of only taking a value of 0 or 1, they can actually take a value that is a mix of 0 and a 1. Sounds simple, right? Well, actually, I like to understand qubits by thinking about paint. You can imagine you have 2 buckets of paint, a yellow bucket and a blue bucket, and you can either decide to go ahead and paint your house bright blue or paint your house bright yellow, that's your choice, or you can paint it a mixture of blue and yellow to create any kind of green that you might want. And this is exactly how qubits work. So instead of just being blue or yellow, a 0 or a 1, we can mix them up so that we get a value that is a mixture of zeros and 1. And the way qubits interact with one another, so the way the quantum computers work, is also sort of familiar to us. Because I'm sure that every one of you has thrown a stone in the sea or in a lake. And what you see is, of course, that there's a ripple effect, and the ripples spread out. And if you were to throw 2 stones in the lake, what you see is this spreading, emanating from both stones. And as the ripples start interacting, in some cases, they will reinforce each other and create a stronger ripple. And in other cases, they will just cancel each other out. This is exactly how quantum computing works. And because of this property, actually, quantum computers are really good at solving very complex calculations. For example, factorizing really large number, or looking through and searching through large data sets. But as far as I know, none of you at home has a quantum computer, right? Well, and that's because actually quantum computing as a science and a technology is very recent, is very new. It's just been proposed in the 1980s with people like Richard Feynman and David Deutsch, who's still alive. And it's just in the last 10, 20 years that this technology has moved from research laboratories at universities into the world of innovation. Today, all the giant tech companies, think about Microsoft, Google, IBM, Intel, they all have quantum computing divisions and scientists trying to build these quantum computers. Indeed, we don't quite know yet what's the best way of building these computers. We're still trying to figure it out. And, well, it did take us many decades, 60, 70 years, to go from the first computers that look like this, massive, extremely mechanical, needing many people to actually go and tune things up, all the way to us having one or multiple laptops in our homes. Well, in fact, with quantum computing, we're just getting started. But still, we are already at the point where a quantum processing unit, a quantum chip, fits in the palm of our hands. And this is the QPU from the company I worked at today, Oxford Ionics. And so let me finish with a thought. Our world is getting hungrier and hungrier for computing power, and this trend is only increasing. If we look at the computing resources, data centers, supercomputing centers, they're still quite scarce in the world, and yet they use up a lot of energy. In the US alone, they use up 5% of the total energy. And quantum computing, well, it has a tremendous potential. On one side, it can actually help us solve some of the toughest challenges in personalized medicine, diagnostics, in understanding climate change, weather modeling, as well as logistics. On the other side, quantum computing also can provide us with better ways, more efficient ways of computing, cutting down costs and the impact on our environment. It might well be that in a few decades is one of our children that stands on this very stage and asks us to imagine the world without quantum computers. Well, thinking about the impact of this technology really does give me the goosebumps, but it's not just about impact for me. Thinking about the fact that us, humankind, has managed to find a way to isolate single atoms, the fundamental building blocks of matter, and to make them dance in front of our eyes and behave exactly as we want so that we can solve the toughest problems that we face. Well, I think this really is poetry. Thank you.